What's going on, everyone? So today is a pretty insane day because we've got like 17 new cars to talk about. Massive spoiler. I literally just made a video yesterday on the first 35 HP base, which a lot of you are excited about. And the Thrawn, my goodness, was that an insane leader. Now, today's leader, not nearly as exciting as Thrawn. Honestly, pretty mediocre looking, but a lot of new cards, including a brand new Boba Fett. My goodness, I can't believe how many times we've seen Boba Fett. But a brand new Boba Fett that we got to talk about, and a bunch of other cards. Let's get started. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, guys. We're starting a weekly tournament over there. Check it out if you want to check out, or if you check out the Patreon demo, you can check it out. And also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below for all your Star Wars Unlimited card needs. Let's talk about the cards because we got a lot to go through today, including, as I mentioned, a brand new leader. Now, Rose Tico, Vigilance Heroism does not nearly give me as much excitement as something like a Thrawn did. We have this action to heal 2 damage from a vehicle unit that attacked this phase. So this action, healing 2 damage, is powerful, but not all the time relevant. If you're able to get the full 2 damage heal, it's actually pretty decent, but there's 2 restrictions. One, it has to be a vehicle unit. That's a massive downside because a lot of the times you're going to have to be building a deck around the vehicle / piloting synergies in order for you to have a vehicle unit that you consistently want to heal. And you also have to have had attacked with that vehicle in that phase. That is a bigger downside. One of the nice things about ObiWan is you can heal damage, even if it's 1 damage, you can heal kind of the random damage that just comes out even without attacking. So your Quinlan pings, the Cad Bane pings, the Django pings coming out from like P38s, all that type of stuff can just get randomly healed. And that's really powerful because you don't need to use an action to attack and then heal. You can just heal immediately to avoid any other combination. Or in Django's case, if they're pinging your units, they're probably exhausting them, which means you wouldn't have been able to even attack with it anyways. The heal 2 damage, I think the extra damage heal does not outweigh the fact that it's restrictive to vehicles and you have had to attack. But she does flip as a 5 resource 4/6, which is decent. And she does have that on attack trigger to heal 2 damage from vehicle, even if it hadn't attacked. So the flip side on her looks okay. She is resistance, which is not an important tag at the moment. Honestly, looks like a pretty horrible leader. I said mediocre, but she looks pretty bad. And honestly, this is the first one where I'm like, wow, this one looks like unplayable, really. She looks like a Finn type leader. But maybe you could do something with the vehicles. Maybe there's enough vehicles because there's a lot of space. There's a lot of vehicles in general coming with the set 4. And maybe there's going to be a piloting vehicle deck where you can put things like Chewbacca on it to prevent it from really dying in another way besides combat damage, but then they can just defeat Chewbacca and then defeat your unit. It's really tough to make Rose work, I think. We'll have to see if she's even playable. Next up, though, we got our first 0-cost pilot. It is R2-D2. It's 1 cost 1/4, so same thing as his other variant, the 1 cost 1/4. And this guy can be played on a friendly vehicle unit with a pilot on it, but you don't necessarily have to have another pilot on it, which is really nice. It also gives that vehicle +1 additional pilot, so you can play another pilot on it. That's why you can go ahead and play this on a vehicle with a pilot, which is really awesome. He does have the Rebel, Droid, and Pilot tags, which is relevant for, well, quite a few different cards. The Droid part for, hey, Invisible Hand, I think that's what it's called. Rebel for Rebel, Pilot for Pilots, synergies from set 4, and it gives +1/+1. So 0 cost upgrade, giving it +1/+1. This is the type of stuff that I'm really excited about. Just imagine for a quick second, guys. Turn 1, you're playing something like Cartel Spacer, or not Cartel Spacer, Cartel Turncoat in your wedge deck. You put a 1 cost pilot on it. It becomes, like a +1/+1, so it becomes a 3/4 with Raid 1. You put another pilot on it for free with Wedge, or with free, not with Wedge, but with R2, because it costs 0. So now it's +4/+5, and it has Raid 1. That's 5 freaking power on turn 1 and 5 toughness. And then on turn 2, you play like a Millennium Falcon, and then you play your free cost pilot card. With Wedge, like that type of stuff is absolutely absurd. That's a lot of damage. You could potentially get up to like 10 damage on turn 2 to your opponent's base, assuming they don't have something to immediately deal with it, which they usually won't. That has a lot of potential, and these cheap pilots, I think, have a lot going for it. Heck, even if you have the new Millennium Falcon, this thing gives you an additional pilot. That is insane. I don't know, guys. I'm pretty excited about this. I know a lot of people are a little bit more on the pessimistic side, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be a super competitive strategy, which is probably what people are thinking. I think it's more just, it's exciting. It's exciting to see these types of potential synergies coming in. And of course, someone mentioned power failure. Yes, that is true. Power failure could come in and ruin your day, but interesting stuff. Boshek is the next one. We got 3-cost ground unit in Cunning. It's a 3/4 with piloting for 2. And when you play this as an upgrade, you discard 2 cards from your deck. You can return each of the odd cost ones to your hand, and it's +1/+2. So piloting for 2, +1/+2 stat line, pretty horrible to be honest, compared to what we're seeing in a lot of other pilots. Like Anakin's getting +2/+3. That's a full 2 points of stats less. So you really want to get this triggered ability when you play it as an upgrade to get some value, like draw 2 or draw 1. But in any given deck, most of the time you have more even costs because you want to play something on turn 1, which is 2-cost cards. And so I've found that you have more even costs in your deck. But let's say it's a 50-50. So you basically draw 1 card off the top of your deck, which is okay. But 2 costs to +1/+2. And you have to have a vehicle unit to pilot onto it. And you're only going to draw 1. It just seems pretty bad to me. And of course, he is a 3-resource, 3/4 base. This one just doesn't look very strong at all. But I don't know. Maybe someone else can see something that I do not. Next up, we got one that I think is pretty sweet. It's a 2-cost space unit in Villainy. It's a 0/4. It's got the Imperial tag. It has the vehicle tag. It's got an on-attack trigger of dealing 3 indirect damage to the defending player. This looks really good. The 4 toughness is really important, I think, because if it had 3 toughness, this thing just dies to basically everything in a single attack. But because it's got 4 toughness, it's going to take like another little bit of work to go ahead and get this killed. A-Wings don't kill it. Like A-Wing plus Wing Leader will kill it. But this is going to be hard to kill in the early stages, and 3 indirect damage. We spoke about this in my previous video when we talked about the new card, but this is a lot of indirect damage. And your opponent's probably going to be taking 1 and then dealing 2 to whatever unit they have, assuming you're going to be an aggressive deck. And if you're playing like Boba Fett, for example, suddenly that's 4 indirect damage. So your opponent takes 2 and their unit takes 2. That's crazy strong. The only downside to this is the fact that it has 0 combat power. If you're attacking a unit, it literally will just lose every single scenario. But I think this has some potential, especially if like the new Boba Fett leader is the de facto indirect damage leader, which it seems like it. I think Tai Bomber could be quite excellent in that, to be honest. IG-88's next card. We got a 5-cost ground unit in Aggression Villainy. It's a 4/5, and when an enemy unit is damaged, it gets +3/+0. It also has piloting 2, Aggression, and Villainy. It gives the same effect that he has, and also +0/+3. So potentially 2 pilot, +3/+3. This to me seems very strong in your indirect damage decks, right? A 7/5 for 5 resources is a lot of stat line, but more importantly, if you're playing these like Tai Bombers, for example, let's just say you go Tai Bomber turn 1, it's a 0/4, your opponent takes some damage. Turn 2, you play something else, like a 3-cost thing, whatever, maybe the new Separatist gunship that deals 3 indirect damage when it dies. And then the following turn, your opponent's gonna have most likely damaged units because you're playing a more aggressive deck. You just pilot this onto something, it gets +3/+3 for 2 resources, and you can make a 2-resource play on that turn. That seems pretty interesting. And again, in these types of decks, I'm not thinking about the long-term value of the pilot. It's not about, oh, is this going to survive? Is my unit going to die? I'm going to get 2 for 1. It's all about, can I leverage this to get immediate value? And this type of card can absolutely do so. 2 resources to essentially get +3/+3 of stat line, maybe just for that turn, is good enough. And then your opponent must deal with it. And this is contingent on the fact that they have a damaged unit. But again, if you're playing that indirect damage deck, it's very likely that your opponent will have a damaged unit. Otherwise, they're just taking all of that damage, and that's a lot of damage to be taking. So I definitely think IG-88 has some potential, more of a pilot, but even if you do play him as a 7/5, like that's a lot of stats. I could definitely see a 7/5 just being something that can end the game. if you just play them naturally, if they have a damage unit. Next up, we've got the brand new Boba Fett. 5 resource ground unit, a 5/4 shielded in Cunning Villainy. He's got a pilot for 2 resources in that Cunning Villainy. When you play it as an upgrade, you may deal 1 damage to a unit, and if we have a transport that he's attached to, you can go ahead and deal 2 damage instead. So +2/+3 in terms of stat line, reasonable. Very, very common to see this +2/+3 in terms of stats. In terms of pilots, or at least that's kind of like the going rate. Dealing 2 damage when he comes down is pretty strong. It's pretty strong. You can go ahead and potentially go ahead and kill a lot of different space units already. It's not restricted to ground or space. Mercenary gunships, Kylo's TIE silencer, those types of things just straight up die. And then dealing potentially 2 damage to one of your opposing ground units, if you're playing, let's say, Cunning Aggression Villainy, can maybe finish something off that took indirect damage, right? Indirect damage is going to be very common. I could definitely see 2 damage finishing off some more powerful units like a K2SO. 100%. Oh, I'll just direct some like 2 indirect damage to K2SO. That's totally fine. I'll take 1 to the base, or even 3 damage to K2SO. And then in those cases, if you don't have a transport, then just the 1 damage is good enough. How common are transports? Well, transports aren't super uncommon, I'd say. One of the premier ones, I believe, is Fett's Fire Spray, if I am remembering correctly. But the Fett's Fire Spray should be a transport. In terms of villainy, what's another one? What's a commonly played? I mean, the Millennium Falcons are transports, but that's not really all that relevant. I don't know if there's all that many transports that we currently have. Certainly yesterday with the new shuttle, that's going to be a transport. The new Fett's Fire Spray is also a transport. I think that the other space units that we talked about yesterday were also transports for the most part. And there's also a couple of transports that we're going to talk about today. So it's actually pretty common. Like, let's say you are playing like the Fett's Fire Spray, both versions, and you're playing Boba Fett as your leader, and you're playing all the indirect damage synergies. This looks really strong, like really, really strong. A way to get some value and get some pump up for some of your units. So I can see this being pretty strong. And then a 5 resource, 5/4 shielded is actually not bad. It's going to potentially survive an attack and then give you the ability to attack in for 5, which can be a little bit risky in a situation where you're going to be playing a lot of space units, assuming you want to get that piloting synergy. Next up, we got Mandalorian is a 5 resource double cunning ground unit, 5/6. When you play it as a unit, you can exhaust up to 2 ground units. And if you pilot for 2 resources, you can exhaust an enemy unit in this arena with +3/+1 for stats. And the piloting is just single cunning. Guys, I love this one. 2 cost piloting to get +3 power is really strong. As I said, we've been seeing +2/+3. And usually toughness is going to be less impactful than power, because if we're using these as temporary stat boosts that you're planning on losing soon, then the +3 power is exactly what you're looking for. Exhausting an enemy unit in its arena is an extremely powerful ability to get the +3/+1 and then basically guarantee an attack, because you're going to be exhausting your opponent's space unit, is really, really nice. I could definitely see this being one of the better, more aggressively statted, aggressively situated pilots. And a 5/6 for 5 resources that exhaust 2 ground units is also pretty strong. I could even see this in like double Yellow Han as just a value piece in situations where exhausting a bunch of units is relevant. Not that that's going to be super relevant in right now's meta, but he's got potential. But I more see him having potential as an upgrade. And I think that's where we're going to see him exhausting a bunch of random space units and just getting a massive stat boost. Next one, and as I said, we got a lot today, so we're going to keep going. We're going to keep going. We got Dengar. It's a 4 resource 5/4 in Aggression Villainy. No stats, but we have a piloting for 2 resources in the same aspects. It gives attached unit on attack, deal 2 indirect damage to a player. If this unit is an underworld unit, deal 3 indirect damage instead. Wow. This looks strong. +1/+2, not amazing stats, as we mentioned earlier, but 2, potentially 3 indirect damage on attack is incredibly strong. One single attack, again, assuming you're playing like a Boba Fett leader, is going to give you 3, potentially 4 indirect damage, which is probably going to hit your opponent pretty hard. Because if you've been doing the indirect damage, your opponent's going to have a bunch of weak units that, well, most likely won't be able to take additional damage without dying. And you can even kind of shift this over to really take advantage of the indirect damage, playing things like Grenade Strike, where it can finish off a couple of small units with just the minor amount of damage that it's dealing. But this indirect damage just looks pretty strong to me overall. I'm not sure how to exactly rate it in the meta as of right now, but every single indirect damage just seems like it has a lot of potential. And as they start to stack together, it really looks stronger and stronger, because direct damage, as you start to put all the indirect damage pieces together, it gets way worse for your opponent, because suddenly it's really hard to redirect certain points of the damage to where it's less effective towards you. And that's when the aggressive kind of situated decks with this indirect damage synergy are going to start to pay off. So I'm really, really interested in this one. Next up, we've got First Order Stormtrooper. This one's a 1-cost ground unit in aggression villainy. It's a 2/1. On attack and when defeated, you deal 1 indirect damage to a player. This one seems pretty reasonable. It's going to be a 2/1. It's going to die to everything. It's going to attack and maybe deal a couple of indirect damage here and there. But honestly, this one looks pretty weak. It is 1 cost to play, but a 2/1 in the ground arena is not really what you're looking for, when everything that seems to work with indirect damage tends to be a space unit or something that attaches to a space unit for the most part. Maybe there's some sort of really go wide indirect damage deck. And the nice thing about it is you're most likely going to be dealing damage to your opponent's base when it attacks and dies, because they can't really redirect to the First Order Stormtrooper or from the First Order Stormtrooper to their units unless they want their units to die and trade with a First Order Stormtrooper if they're attacking it. So that's something to consider, but seems pretty mediocre to not that great. Next up, we got Dagger Squadron Pilot, a nice 1-resource ground unit in Cunning Heroism. It's a 2/1. It has piloting for 1, and it gets +2/+1. A nice pilot. This is basically like the Independent Senator, I think, with the +1/+1 in Raid 1. Imagine just stacking a couple of these across a couple of your space units. Of course, you can't put it on the same unit, but you have a couple Cartel Turncoats or Cartel Turncoat and Millennium Falcon. And you got all these like tiny little buffs and things like that. These are like surprise strikes, right? Again, just putting it on, getting in for some damage immediately, and then making every single subsequent turn really a nightmare for your opponent unless they're dealing with the unit or the upgrade. So this one, again, not exciting necessarily, just something that reinforces the overall thought process about how I'm thinking about pilots. Next up, we've got Leia Orana. This is a brand new 3-cost ground unit in Command Heroism. It's a 3/4 with Rebel Official and Restore 1. And when you play it, you may attack with a pilot unit or a unit with a pilot on it. It gets +1/+0 and gains Restore 1 for this attack. So I would have loved to see Leia have a split mode, just like the other pilots, where you have this when played and you have a pilot option. But I think what they could have done with this card is like make the pilot option the option that you don't want to do, and you want to actually play her as a normal unit because it's going to trigger the more powerful when played. But in the fail case where you don't have a pilot, it's not like she's just a 3-resource 3/4 with Restore 1. The resource 3 or 4 with Restore 1 is okay. It's not amazing. It's not terrible. The when played ability does look very, very powerful. We've seen this with like Fleet Lieutenant, even getting +2/+0, and that's it. But curving into it is really strong. Again, I'm thinking like a wedge deck. Turn 1, you go Cartel Turncoat with Anakin Skywalker on it. Turn 2, you go and Leia Orana, and you get in for 4/+1, so 5 damage, and you Restore 1, and you deploy to 3/4. Those are the types of things that I think are pretty cool, and I do think this has some potential, but I'm not sure how strong it truly is because it doesn't necessarily fit the theme. It's more like a one of, okay, I'm going to get this when played attack in, but we'll see if that's good enough with just the +1/+0. It does require more setup because you need to have a pilot unit or a unit with a pilot on it, and those pilot units tend to be a little bit weak, and then the unit with a pilot on it tends to be a little bit more expensive because you need to combo a couple different cards together, but we'll see. Next up, we got Shuttle Tidderium. 3-cost space unit in Cunning Heroism. It's a 2/4 Rebel vehicle transport. On attack, discard a card from your deck. If it has an odd cost, you may give an experience token to another unit. This one might have some potential. As we've seen with Han, the new Han that is, he is all about those odd cards. And I mean, this one's not too bad, just constantly filling up your ground/space areas with a bunch of experience tokens if you're able to guarantee an experience token from this. I think the big thing for me is twofold. Rebel tag is really relevant here because we can play with all of our Rebel synergies. The other thing that's really relevant is the fact that this shuttle can do it every single turn, which is pretty decent. Now, if you think about it, the best way this goes is like turn 1, you play multiple 1 resource plays. Turn 2, you play the shuttle. And then turn 3, you go ahead and do a couple of like a 3 resource play and a 1 resource play. And that's the way you kind of get some value out of the shuttle, playing just all odd cards, all giving experience tokens, and all just passing it around and making a lot of plays and going wide. But then buffing up the going wide strategy with the shuttle. I don't know how strong this truly is. I think the odd cost is going to be a tricky thing to build around, but there might be some potential there. IG-2000 is the next one. 4-cost space unit in aggression villainy. It's a 3/4 with overwhelm. When played, you deal 1 damage to each of up to 3 units. So pretty straightforward, but honestly, this is a card where I think could have some potential as well in that indirect damage deck. In those situations, oftentimes, if you're being the aggressor, your opponent's going to kind of separate as much damage as they can to not take it into their base, but divide it up amongst their units. And there's going to be a lot of situations, I imagine, where your opponent's just sitting with a unit that has 1 remaining HP, and this can potentially finish off those units. Can you imagine, like, turn 1, you play your Tai Bomber, you attack. On turn 2, your opponent has a Sabine. They take 2 damage to their Sabine, take 1 into their base. They attack you back. They play something like, or maybe they play a Fleet Lieutenant and attack you back. Then you go ahead and play like the Separatist Shuttle. And then the following turn, on turn 3, you attack with a Tai Bomber again. And your opponent goes ahead and takes 2 damage to their Fleet Lieutenant and 1 damage to their base. And then you play an IG-2000, kill their Sabine, kill their Fleet Lieutenant, and then deal 1 to another unit. That seems pretty interesting to me. Not that that's going to be good enough necessarily. I think this has potential, but we'll see if that's going to be kind of that consistent feel. Next up, we've got Hound Tooth, 3 resource space unit in Cunning Villainy. It's a 4/3 underworld vehicle transport, as you're seeing more and more transports for Boba Fett. While attacking an exhausted unit that didn't enter play this phase, this unit deals combat damage before the defender. Kind of interesting they gave Hound Tooth this ability instead of Boba Fett's, since Boba Fett is the unit that has this effect. Hound Tooth is Bosk's ship, but that's besides the point. 4/3 for 3 resources in space is a pretty powerful stat line. We see 3/4s a lot, but 4/3s are a little bit more aggressively slanted. This one, I can definitely see this being insanely powerful. Just imagine in decks like Django, or imagine in a deck that's playing like the Mandalorian, right? Mandalorian isn't restricted to heroism. It has cunning. So you turn 1, play something. Turn 2, you play Hound's Tooth. Turn 3, you go ahead and pilot up another unit, exhaust a unit, kill it with Hound's Tooth for free. Like, that type of stuff seems pretty powerful. And the fact that it has a decent stat line already is really, really working for it, I think, pretty strongly. Next up, we've got Commandeer, 5-cost event in Cunning. You get to take control of a non-leader vehicle that costs 6 or less without a pilot. If you do, ready it, and at the start of the next regroup phase, return that unit to its owner's hand. This seems like an insane sideboard card. Just imagine what you could do right now. Fett's Fire Spray. It comes down, you play a Commandeer, you get to take it, attack with it, and then it bounces it. I think that's the real key kicker, is that it bounces it. It doesn't just go back. If you think about this compared to like Change of Heart, Change of Heart is already an amazing sideboard card. And Change of Heart doesn't have the restrictions of making it cost 6 or less, or a vehicle unit, right? And on a vehicle unit that doesn't have a pilot on it. But this has way higher upside than Change of Heart in terms of on a level playing field. because you get to get in the damage, and then you get to set your opponent back in terms of tempo. Change of Heart's a nice way to get a finisher in, but Commandeer actually keeps board parity even by not deploying to the board because it bounces their unit. And that is really, really interesting. So I think that Commandeer has some massive potential in this next set. And then lastly, we got the final card of today. We've got Electromagnetic Pulse. Very simple, 1-cost event in Cunning. Deal 2 damage to a droid or a vehicle and exhaust it. This one seems like it could be a very big staple if droids and vehicles are super common. If we have a lot of space units, heck, Electromagnetic Pulse would be an amazing potential sideboard card against like a Jango deck, right? Lots of vehicles, Mercenary Gunship, Silencer, the P-38, all those are vehicles, I believe, right? P-38, P-38 is a vehicle, right? It's a vehicle. You can triple dark rate it. So all of those things can go ahead and get just completely annihilated by Electromagnetic Pulse. And even if it doesn't kill it, it exhausts it. And we've seen how powerful that can be with the Perilous Position. Now, Perilous Position is a permanent effect of -2/-2. This one just deals 2 damage, but it's also 2 less resources. Electromagnetic Pulse looks like a really, really strong card in the right scenario. Very, very powerful potential. But that's going to wrap it up, guys. What do you think about Roast Tico? What do you think about all these indirect damage things and cheap pilots, as we're seeing a lot of? Do they actually have potential in the next set? I think that this set just looks really cool, and I'm excited to see this different way to play Star Wars Unlimited than we've been used to, with just units versus units. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.